Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Einen schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und heißen Sie herzlich willkommen zu unserer Fellows Presentation. The rest in English. Welcome to the presentation of the Fall 2017 Fellows of the American Academy in Berlin. It's a very special pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests and friends, including excellencies, members of government, and, as is always a real treat, a group of our trustees, Hans-Michael Gießen, John Kornblum, Volker Schlöndorff, and especially, if you allow me that special notice, Kati Martin, who has a second capacity this semester as a writer-in-residence at the American Academy. It is also a pleasure to acknowledge our founding executive director, Gary Smith, and our former Dean of Fellows, Pamela Rosenberg. Our board chair, Gail Burt, couldn't be here tonight. Gail, I assume you are watching now or will be watching soon, and we want you to know we miss you and feel your presence and your inestimable contribution. It's a real pleasure for me to work in this amazing house every day with Academy colleagues, all of whom help to build an event such as this one, all of whom I want to thank collectively, whether they are, so to speak, on camera or off camera. Since this evening is about our fellows, permit me to single out especially Carol Scherer and Joanna Gallup, who managed the selection process that yielded this amazing cohort. Most of all, welcome officially, Class of Fall 2017. You are, and I really want to emphasize this because I find it exciting, you are our 39th cohort of fellows, and the 39th cohort in the fall means that the 40th cohort will arrive in the spring, and we now mark the start of the 20th year of the American Academy's fellowship program. Now, if this greeting sounds familiar to you as, or similar as the greeting of a freshman class, this is because there are indeed similarities. Let me assure you, class of F-17, of three things in that general vein. Number one, you are all gifted and unique, selected painstakingly from a pool of some 300 applicants. Number two, you will have a great stay here, and the time will go faster than you think. Number three, our retention and graduation rates are the best in the business. As we introduce you to a wide circle of Berlin friends of the Academy, we also introduce an exciting academic year, to be highlighted by your lectures, by the presence and presentations of numerous distinguished visitors in the arts, humanities, social sciences, and public policy, by programs in Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Hamburg, and Tallinn, in addition, of course, to Berlin, to Richard C. Holbrooke Fora on diplomacy in the Balkans and on the new digital diplomacy, to a symposium on the new global Europe in conjunction with the presence of the International Board of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. More broadly, we have identified a series of key themes that will inflect conversation within the American Academy and increasingly with partners in Berlin and beyond, beginning with the topic migration and integration, continuing with race and comparative perspective, and following with the topic exile and return. We are launching an initiative on digitalization, including but not limited to the Holbrooke Forum, and we are looking forward to expanding our programming on this and other issues to locations in the United States through a series of colloquia led by some of our most distinguished alumni. Excitement is the partner of expectation. It is clear to all of us in the Hans Arnold Center, as well as to our associates and friends in Germany, the United States, and indeed around the world, that more is expected of us now than ever. Our central mission and the vision of our founders, the sustenance and enhancement of transatlantic dialogue and cooperation through multiple academic disciplines and creative as well as political practices, has entered a period of fragility and anxiety. As you all know, the American Academy in Berlin is an independent, nonpartisan, and privately funded institution. Essentially, it is an academy. As an academy, it rests on basic principles. We are here to build knowledge, the knowledge associated with curation and the transmission of archives and traditions, as well as the knowledge associated with innovation, discovery, originality, novelty. Knowledge and its applications cannot happen without the basic integrity of the fact, including what Emil Durkheim called the social fact. There is no such thing as an alternative fact. Facts enable the development of counting and reading, of observation and explanation, categories perhaps familiar to the natural and social sciences, and of translation and interpretation, as most familiar to the humanities and the arts. Second, knowledge is a live being and must therefore be shared, disseminated, rendered subject to critique and self-critique, revision, and, as Max Weber poignantly wrote exactly 100 years ago, in 1917, capable of encouraging its own obsolescence. Knowledge, therefore, cannot exist without education. Perhaps the greatest achievements of modern higher education in the United States have been, first, the integration of teaching and research, in other words, the inclusion of students as apprentices in the making of new knowledge, and second, the diversification of student populations, including generations of immigrant communities, as well as the slow and ever-challenging recognition of domestic diversity and inclusion. To cite a trope that became especially well known in this city almost 20 years ago, education of the kind I am referring to is for the Bevölkerung rather than for the Volk. These days, we American scholars are intensely worried about the survival of these principles, which are suddenly in far greater danger than anyone thought possible. We have become somewhat inured in the United States to politically motivated attacks on science, on climate change, on the arts and the humanities. Anti-intellectualism in American life, to cite the historian Richard Hofstadter's famous title of 1963, over half a century ago, is nothing new. In the same way, we know that our social fabric is easily torn by racial violence, beginning with slavery and its legacies. But we are not inured to the normalization of such violence by the highest elected officials. After Brexit, after the Hungarian government attack on the Central European University in Budapest, to mention just two examples, we also know that we share these dangers with more European interlocutors than we did even a year ago. And we know that transatlantic and indeed global solidarities are required in order to move forward with both the curational and the innovational dimensions of knowledge making in all areas. Faced with these challenges, ladies and gentlemen, the American Academy punches well above its weight, as our dear colleague Gail Burt likes to say. My own bond with the American Academy began actually centimeter by centimeter in the same spot with my fellowship semester in the fall of 2003. I recall my so-called fellows presentation very well. One of my classmates, Wendy Lesser, is here tonight, so she may vouch for what I'm saying. And Wendy, hi. For many of us, Germany in 2003 was not only post-wall, but also still in some ways post-war. Things are profoundly different now. I know that for many people, a kind of second Wende took place between 2004 and 2006, understood as the normalization of national identity and channeled largely through the spirit around football championships. I tend to place emphases elsewhere, partly because I'm not an athlete, but I tend to place emphases elsewhere nevertheless, and largely in the growth of Germany's self-understanding as an international and indeed a global player. Coming back in 2016, I came to a Germany that in many ways had switched places with the United States as a responder to the global migration crisis, as a society in which public debates and civil society initiatives about the constitution of society are difficult, often painful, and also fundamentally healthy. It has been riveting for me to see how politics lives in culture, to read, for example, the intense debates around the new directorship of the Volksbühne and its transformation from a theater of the folk, in the many valences of that word, to precisely a theater of the Bevölkerung. It was fascinating to hear Ivan Krastev a few weeks ago at the Hertie School of Governance refer to international education as a hedge against, quote, intellectual protectionism. And it was equally fascinating just 2 evenings ago to hear Bundespräsident Steinmeier host a panel on the future of democracy and observe that current debates about cultural identity begin with the assumption of the reality of multicultural identity. If the American Academy brings to Berlin the best minds the United States has to offer, a claim I sincerely believe you will see justified in the next few minutes, we also crave the kinds of negotiating space that contemporary Germany, and especially the city of Berlin, have to offer. Such is also the legacy of this house, which has emerged from the most difficult German century as a beacon of such remarkable dignity and generosity. It is now my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome this evening's distinguished speaker, Professor Jutta Allmendinger. Professor Allmendinger has held the position of Professor of Educational Sociology and Labor Market Research at the Humboldt University and has served as president of the WCB in Berlin, the Berlin Social Science Center, since 2007. She is the first person to lead this institution, one of Europe's largest social science research centers, with roughly 140 economists, political scientists, sociologists, historians, and lawyers researching topics such as labor market and employment policy, social inequality, democracy, and civil society. Her principal research areas include the sociology of the labor market, the sociology of education, and social inequality. In her research on education, Allmendinger has examined the effects of poor education on the health, life expectancy, and political participation of citizens. She has significantly contributed in this way to the understanding of what is called Bildungsarmut, or educational poverty. In 2008, she was awarded the Communicator Award, the science award of the Donors Association, awarded by the German Research Foundation, the DFG, quote, in recognition of her outstanding ability to raise public awareness of her research work on pressing topics in the fields of social, educational, and labor market policy. And she is the possessor of the Bundesverdienstkreuz, the Federal Cross of Merit, first class, for her pioneering work in the studies of educational policy, labor markets, and gender equality. She is the author and co-author of over a dozen books and more than 140 articles in leading journals on social inequality, educational sociology, labor market research, demography, and social stratification. Her most recent book, which is circulating around the American Academy, Das Land, in dem wir leben wollen, wie die Deutschen sich ihre Zukunft vorstellen, the country in which we want to live, how the Germans imagine their future, takes up questions of how the people of Germany would like to live their lives and what they wish for their futures. Please join me in welcoming Professor Allmendinger.
Good evening to all of you, and thank you for coming. Dear Mr. Steinberg, dear trustees of the American Academy, dear representatives of the 39th class of American Academy Fellows, dear American Academy staff fellows, and I think this also deserves an applause. You did a wonderful job. The rest in German. No, I'm kidding. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome the new fellows to Berlin. Not the most beautiful city. We know that beauty is always in the eyes of the beholder. But in any case, the most interesting city in Germany. Forget about the now famous, poor but sexy description coined by the former mayor Klaus Wobereit. Berlin is not the poorest city anymore, and instead of using sexy as a word that describes this place best, I would rather take words like innovative, lively, exciting, multifaceted. Multifaceted, multi-layered, complex, simultaneous. All this does not only describe the city, but also your situation, in a geographic and, I think, in an intellectual sense. The simultaneousness of your being who you are, and yet having been transplanted to another place on the planet, temporarily trying out a new way of life, gives you a space to breathe deeply, to look more closely, to register more attentively your surroundings and your work. I envy your situation, but celebrate the thought that I will soon experience a similar situation, having just received the honor of being the first Thomas Mann Fellow in his villa in Los Angeles. This simultaneousness and complexity also works in terms of geography. The villa of the Arnhold family here is most romantically situated at the Wannsee, far out of the buzz of the city. Its quietness and sheer beauty will allow you to lead a monasterial life of concentration and duty. And yet you only need to step out on the street into the S-Bahn and you will find yourself in the city, only minutes away from the most wonderful institutions of culture, of the arts, of politics, and of the sciences. The sciences being my field, and please allow me to say a few more words about them. For the past years, Berlin has been number one in terms of science and research in Germany. And here I not only refer about all those metrics of the German Science Foundation and who got the most third-party money and things like this, but for me, much more importantly, is the so-called soft factors as the basis of good and innovative research, commonality, trust, and interest in each other. And those are hard facts, I think. The 4 universities in Berlin, the many non-university institutes of the Leibniz, Helmholtz, Max Planck, and Fraunhofer alliances offer open doors and most curious scientists. The disciplines not only work together, they dovetail and blend into each other. All disciplines of yours will find the right person to talk in our institutions. Just stop by, please stop by, and I tell you, you don't even have to knock at the door. The special simultaneously and complexity also works in terms of timing. We meet here 3 days before the German federal elections. A very important moment, even more special for you, who for the past 2 years have occupied yourselves with the most surprising elections ever. Compared to the United States, it is quiet here, stable. Our problems are most luxurious. We know who will be our next chancellor, or at least we think that we know it. And we know that on the surface, few things will change. But mind you, it's only on the surface. Beneath this, we can note delicate developments, changes in our sensitivities, slowly changing norms that announce future ruptures and a lot of conflicts. And of course, you will meet with a species that you just became acquainted with in your own country. The angry citizens, the protesters, the growing group of persons who feel threatened or left behind. On the other hand, you will meet with Germans that are less self-righteous and more open to changes that you may have expected. Thus, I think it's a perfect time and place to be here. Being in Germany, away from your home, being in this monastery/city and being here at a time when the most important changes are coming up, complex and below the surface. All this will sharpen your senses, I'm sure, and give you a new angle, a new perspective on your work. And all this brings me now to the core of what I'm going to present to you now in a couple of words. It's a thick book, but I can, put it in short. And it's about the legacy of the Germans. I will give you some insights into a study. I have recently finished this study, or I have finished parts of it, I have to say, because it's ongoing, together with the weekly magazine, The Zeit and Infos. It deals with the present situation of people in Germany, the world they want to live in, and the reality they expect to happen here in Germany. The data of this study is huge. We talked to 3,100 people. We talked to people aged 14 to 80. We talked to poor and rich people, to educated, non-educated people, to people living in the city and on the countryside, to people living in East and West Germany. And we didn't only ask cognitive questions, but we also asked them to taste and smell and to listen to rhythms, always asking 3 questions. The first question was, how do you feel today? What is important for you today? The second question is, well, think about your children. Think about the future generation. What do you want to pass over to them? What's your legacy? This is why the name legacy came up. And the third question is a hard break. It is a question, what do you expect will happen? So how will reality look like? And of course, we easily can compare the answers of those people from question 1 to question 2. And this tells us a lot on whether or not they are satisfied with their own life. I mean, if I tell Michael Steinberg, well, if he would be my son, for example, well, please continue to this or that, or put big values on whatever, it also would indicate that I'm not doing it and I'm quite unsatisfied with how I deal with my life. So if I do not pass over to the next generation what I myself do, I mean, this creates a sense of unsatisfaction, dissatisfaction. In comparing question 2 and 3, so this is a question on what do I want and what actually other people do. So what do I want to happen and what will happen in the future, tells me a lot about optimism, pessimism, fear, anger, and things like this. So let me give you a very quick oversight about the first narrative, comparing how I live and what I want to pass over to the next generation. And the 5 big issues for people living in Germany are a sense of belonging, and they fear that there is, they would like to see stability, so they pass on to the next generation. Please keep this friendship, closeness, sense of belonging. Take it very, very seriously. Don't lose this. The second, quite amazingly, was employment. And employment for Germans is extremely important. It's important for people aged 14 in as much as it has been important for people aged 80. This was quite unexpected for me. And I asked questions like, well, do you want to go to work even if you do not need the money? And more than 60% said, yes, of course. And I will talk about the reasons for this in a little while. The third is watching health, food, climate. And here they were dissatisfied. They said, well, yes, of course. I mean, my health is important, but it should be more important. Of course, it's important for me what kind of water I drink, but I take it more seriously, and in particular about climate and climate change. They say, watch it to the next generation, to their children. And then the fourth thing was on education, on an understanding of technological change. So they see that they deal with technology, but to the future generations they say, well, you have to understand technology, because otherwise you can't keep up with digitalization, with technological change. So watch it. And the last one was on solidarity and equality. Solidarity and equality is a point which is extremely important to Germans, and it is important to people with a lot of money, but also with people with not a lot of money. Now, moving from this, how do I live, what is important for me, and what should be important for the next generation, I now turn to the second comparison. What do I expect, what I hope, and what actually will happen? And in terms of the sense of belonging and closeness and friendship, people fear an erosion. I call it erosion because they think, I want to keep it, but this is nothing which will continue. This is in danger, this feeling of belonging. This also concerned about employment. They think, well, I mean, it's important for me, and employment should be important for the next generation, but it can't be so important for the generations to come. I mean, what's really happening is that employment becomes less important, or that for reasons I will talk briefly about. Concerning health, food production, and climate, we see quite a different level and change over those three questions. As I said before, the things that should take more attention to health and food production and climate change. Do it better, say they to the next generation. But they think that the world becomes even worse, so that indeed the next generation doesn't care about it. So they want to have it better, but others do it even worse. So they really need help. That's my interpretation of this sort of figure, which looks like that. And the same applies to education and technology. So they are very pessimistic about it and very much hope that something will change, but they don't expect that it's going to change to the better. And the same applies to solidarity and equality. Now, of course, the most important question then is what can be done? And in terms of the sense of belonging and getting to know people who are different from yourself, I think that Germany, as much as other nations, are in danger because we see in higher and higher segregation of our city, an increasing segregation of our educational system. We see an increasing segregation of who is using which kind of cars or traffic or public transportation. So we need to think about places where we can meet again. We have to think about something like even compulsory civil service. We need to think about possibilities to keep cities together, to do something against segregation. And I think that there are many ways we can do this, but we have to be more serious about it. And everybody talks about it, but I don't think that there are some cities who really do it effectively. And when I looked at the party programs, this was not one of the main pillars of all political parties. The second is the issue of employment. People are in work. Unemployment rates are extremely low in Germany in the moment, lower than they have been over the last 20 years. But at the same time, people work in jobs of which they know that they are going to disappear. In real life, simultaneously. They are cleaning the streets, and at home, they have the sensor-driven robot who is cleaning their apartment. And in this simultaneously, they can't deal. I mean, they have anger, they have fear, they have nobody to ask. There is no one institution in Germany who can be addressed, who can help. In Germany, institutions help ones who are unemployed. But of course, I mean, this can't be the case that they first have to get unemployed and then they get help. So we have to build up and to have to monitor the development of the labor market and then giving some hope and some help, some real help and transparency to people. And I think that we can do this on a 5 or 10 year period, not longer than that, but this would help indeed. The third thing, health, climate change, is quite different because I don't think that people can do something about it themselves. I mean, this resignation curve, as I've indicated before. But when I ask people, so 3,100 people, they say, well, what we really need is state regulation. So that's quite different. I mean, it's a mechanism where they say, well, food should be forbidden if they are not produced well, or we have to regulate climate change. So they really want the state to step in. And in terms of education, my fourth point, things are different again, because what Germans want is to have the possibility to have a second and a third chance. And here I think the differences between Germany and the US are still very high. In Germany, you have a very regulated life course. You have education first, then you have labor market participation, and then you can retire. In the US, it's different, because if you are studying, I mean, it's quite normal, or at least has been quite normal, that after your bachelor, you took out some years and go to work, and then you come back to university doing your master and PhD. This is not what German students want. They want to be fast, and the educational system has now has only now covering less years than before. So we are running in Germany, although we are getting older and good health. So we have more time, but we are taking for things less time than we have, and we still don't have really second education. So when I teach, I have people aged 20 and people aged 60 or 70, but I have not people aged 40 who are in the class to become a second education for different jobs. And this is not just, it's a university system, it's also in the dual or in the apprenticeship system in Germany. We are not really ready for a chance which we really need. We live our traditional life courses. And the last one is solidarity, and it's of course on inequality. This was one of the prime topics of one party, and many journalists are saying, well, this was not the topic people are interested. This is not true according to my data. People are highly interested in inequality. I mean, it's a question which they deal with day to day in their own life, but they deal with it in a different way. Politics has addressed it. They are not as much concerned with inequality of wealth, although they should be. They're extremely concerned about the range of income. How can I have, only 1/100th of the income of another person? There can't be achievement behind it. I mean, this is just something they cannot grasp, they cannot understand. So they are calling even for something which we have never seen in Germany. They call for maximum wage and not only for minimum wage. And they stand up for having equal possibilities in terms of health care, in terms of pensions. So they are ready to give and to live a life in solidarity. And this particular applies to people in all classes. I mean, it also applies to rich people indeed. So let me come to a close. I hope that I have been able to show you some aspects of when we talk about Germany. Those Germans are not all angry. Those Germans are probably more innovative than you would think. And they don't only cherish their home and their castle, as many people say. So they are open-minded. And again, I think they would all be willing to talk to you, if you would like to do this. And of course, I mean, we hope that you do this. The bill now I mean, they will be different, and at the same time, they will be similar to you, maybe recognizable for you when you meet them, and certainly often enough very different from how I just have described them. It's now my turn, it's now our turn, and huge pleasure to listen to you and to your project. They are surely just as complex, ever-changing, multifaceted. I'm curious, we all are curious, to learn more from you and do hope to be able to speak with you later this evening and in the coming weeks. And as I said, it's not just the WZB, the Science Research Center. You can stop by. Our doors are open. The doors of all universities are open. We just opened, actually, a new institute on digitalization with 8 institutions of Berlin being part of it. And we all be able to work together, and they will all be able to work with you. So, this having said, I give over to Nancy Foner, who is, and it is my great pleasure, a fellow sociologist.
So, I'm Nancy Foner, and I'm a distinguished professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and I'm very deeply honored to be here as the Berthold Leibinger Fellow. So in terms of my work, I specialize in immigration. I've written and edited more than a dozen books about it. I teach about it, I speak about it, and I serve on a variety of academic and civic groups that deal with it. My approach is comparative, comparing immigrants in Europe and North America, in sending societies and receiving societies, and in the present and in the past. I actually started out my career as an anthropologist, studying the dynamics that underpinned migration from a Caribbean sending society, Jamaica, and I went on to study Jamaican migrants in receiving societies in New York and London, especially on issues of racial inequality, ethnicity, and gender. As a born and bred New Yorker, it's no surprise that I've written widely on immigration to New York City, the quintessential American immigrant city. I've written on immigration to New York in both the past and in the present, in a book called From Ellis Island to JFK, New York's Two Great Waves of Immigration, and the book dispels myths about immigrants then and now, and analyzes what's new about contemporary immigration. More recently, and in my latest book, Strangers No More, I compare the challenges of integration for immigrants and their children in North America and Western Europe. For example, why is immigrant religion a more significant divide in Western Europe than in the US? Why is race a greater barrier for Black immigrants in the US? Why is residential segregation much less of a problem for immigrant minorities in Europe than it is in the US? Because immigration is a major source of change in the US as well as in Europe, my work has long been concerned not just with how immigration has reshaped the lives of immigrants and their children, which is obviously critical, but also how it's affected the cities and countries where immigrants have settled. And this is the focus of a book project that I've started working on at the Academy this fall, which comes back to highlight the US, and the working title is Immigration and the Transformation of America. How large is that impact? Well, let me just cite 2 remarkable facts. First, the US admits more than 1 million legal immigrants a year. And second, US immigrants and their children constitute about 1/4 of the US population. That's 1 in 4 Americans. Among the topics that I'm exploring, how immigration has been changing America's racial order, how it's influencing political and policy shifts, creating new kinds of neighborhoods and a new ethnic geography, reshaping the ethnic division of labor and having an impact on segments of the economy, and changing cultural practices, tastes, and lifestyle and styles. And while I'm mostly looking at the US, I also take a comparative transatlantic view, considering recent transformations in Western Europe in response to immigration. So I'm very grateful to the Academy for giving me the space and time and such a wonderful environment and wonderful colleagues in which to work on this project. And once again, I am very honored to be here this semester.
Hello. My name is Kira Thurman, and I am an Anna Maria Kellen Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. I am an assistant professor of German Studies and History at the University of Michigan in the United States, and I also have a strong training and sustained interest in musicology. My friends jokingly call me an honorary musicologist. Growing up as a daughter of an African-American father and a Jamaican mother in both Austria and in the United States, my experiences dealing with race on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean led me to investigate Europe's historical and contemporary relationship to the Black diaspora. As a classically trained pianist myself, who constantly got asked in university why I don't play jazz, my favorite composer is Haydn. Right. I also became interested in the relationship between classical music and Blackness, two things we frequently assume do not belong together. I am here at the American Academy then to write my first book, which is called Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. My book explores the relationship between classical music, which we oftentimes think of as free from the politics of race, and Black music making, which we usually locate only in genres such as jazz, gospel, or hip hop. My book presents us with another history, one of Black musicians traveling from the United States, the Caribbean, and from within Europe to Germany and Austria as early as the 1850s to study and to perform the music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. In general terms, what many scholars have talked about lately is how classical music presents itself as a universal language. But if it is a universal language, it has a very strong German accent. The music of Mozart, Beethoven, and other composers from Germany and Austria make up classical music's core. My question is, if classical music, or Western art music, is a universal language, what happens when non-European peoples try to speak it? My book answers this question by exploring Black musical migration to Central Europe from the 1870s until the 1960s, and by paying attention to how audiences in cities such as Berlin, Vienna, Salzburg, and Munich understood what they were hearing and seeing. Audiences were often shocked to discover that if they just closed their eyes and listened with their ears, the performer sounded just like a German. But if Germanness was something that could be performed, what did that mean for audiences' understandings of race and nationalism? I am very thankful to the American Academy in Berlin for giving me the time this semester to think more deeply about how racial and national identities are created, maintained, and challenged through musical performance and reception across the Atlantic Ocean. Thank you.
So in my other life, when I am not residing at the Academy, which is sadly not the majority of time, I teach history of art as well as film and media studies at the University of California in Irvine. And as you might be able to tell from the way I speak, I've spent much of my life in California now, almost half of it. But I was actually born and raised in Moscow, Russia. And this accounts in no small part for my academic interests, which lie in modern art and photography, but especially in Soviet modern art and visual culture. So here at the Academy, I'm working on two interconnected projects, which both examine the paths of avant-garde Soviet art in the decade or so following Joseph Stalin's rise to power in the late 1920s and in the 1930s. And I focus on artists who are actually ardent believers in the Bolshevik project, more or less from the very beginning, and there are some usual suspects, so to speak. So Alexander Rodchenko, photographer, is the focus of the book I'm currently finishing. But there's also El Lissitzky and Vladimir Tatlin and Vera Mukhina, who you might not know by name, but you might have seen the colossal sculpture of the worker and the kolkhoz woman, who are striving forward with the hammer and the sickle towards the future. So the work of these artists in the late 1920s and in the 1930s was, of course, entirely state-sponsored. But I'm not interested in the way that it supported the party's ideology. Rather, I'm interested in what the art signified or disclosed in excess of the state's and even often the artist's own intentions. So one of the key questions at the heart of my work is whether and how art can have a revelatory or even an emancipatory impulse and effect in a totalitarian society under conditions of unfreedom. So in other words, I examine what I believe to actually be the innate slipperiness and contingency of art objects, the way they can propose different ways of thinking and living to the receptive viewer. And these moments of alterity or possibility in Soviet art are mostly reside in the margins. They're small, they're peripheral, sometimes accidental, often hard to see. But to me, it's precisely also these small moments that confirm the importance of both close looking and slow thinking, something that I think is really important to both a conscientious re-examining of the legacies of the Russian Revolution. It's actually the centennial of the October Revolution this fall, but also that I think is really important to our current political moment. So unfortunately, I don't have time for a specific example today, but if you're interested, I would love to see you at my lecture here at the Academy on December 7th. And before closing, I just really want to give a brief word of thanks. First of all, to my fellow fellows for all the lively conversations we've had so far, and the many that I'm sure are coming. To all those of you in attendance who came here on a weeknight. And last but most certainly not least, I'd really like to thank the staff of the Academy who go out of their way every day to make our life here extraordinarily easy, pleasant, and delicious. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. I'm Dilip Gaukar, the Bosch Fellow in Public Policy during this fall quarter or semester at the American Academy. I'm grateful to the Academy for the award of Berlin Prize and for the opportunity to be part of this distinguished group of fellows, scholars, writers, and artists at such a beautiful location with a complex history. Before I briefly introduce my work and research project, I would like to thank, as has everybody else, the staff of the Academy for the extraordinary hospitality they have extended to us. Their patience and good humor in dealing with our inquiries and anxieties has been exemplary. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a professor of rhetoric and public culture and director of Center for Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University. I have two sets of scholarly interest: rhetoric as an intellectual tradition, both in its ancient roots and in its contemporary mutations, and global modernities and their impact on democratic politics. Regarding my work on modernity and democracy, which is related to the project at the Academy, I've been active in the last 2 decades in organizing conferences and editing volumes such as Alternative Modernities, Cultures of Democracy, New Social Imaginaries, and Globalizing American Studies. I'm currently working at the Academy on a book manuscript entitled Crowds, Riots, and Politics of Disorder. Perhaps easiest way to introduce you to what I mean by politics of disorder is by gesturing towards the resurgence of new populisms all over the world, including in the economically advanced and democratically mature countries of North America and Western Europe. The populist challenge is no longer confined to the third world or the global south or the poor countries where bottom billions live, as made manifest last year in quick succession by Brexit and the election of Donald Trump to the US presidency. Populism is a specter that haunts democracies everywhere. What went wrong? Ask scholars and publicists of every ilk since the triumphal days of 1989, when the third wave of democratic revolutions, as according to Samuel Huntington, was in full swing and would culminate in the Arab Spring of 2010, and when Francis Fukuyama had announced the end of history with the global advent of Western liberal democracy as the final and the perfect form of government. What went wrong? In the last decade, especially since the devastating global crisis of 2008, democratic gains made in the last quarter of a century seems to be slipping away. Democracy is in crisis, it is under duress, it is retreating from its liberal ideals and commitments while keeping the electoral cloak. It is becoming steadily illiberal. What went wrong? That is the topic of my research project here at the Academy. Populism is the most visible symptom of our current political malaise and predicament. Populism is not about to go away. It is making liberals, which includes me, very anxious. But anxiety does not yield good analysis. If you are transfixed by the ugly and sometimes lethal rhetoric of populists and their demagogic leaders, be it a Trump or a Le Pen or an Orban or an Erdogan or a Putin or a Modi, and derive great satisfaction in deconstructing that rhetoric as a disfiguration of the democratic endeavor, you might be cathartic, but you will not get very far in identifying the underlying causes that are galvanizing populist movements today. The populist challenge points to the structural tension inherent in the representative democracy, the inescapable tension between the elite and the masses. The populist complaint is decidedly anti-elite. It harbors an abiding suspicion that representative democracy in a complex modern society has inexorable oligarchic tendencies. It serves the elites, protects their privileges and property before attending to the needs and demands of the common people. Further, these oligarchic tendencies become acute and highly visible in periods of major socioeconomic transition and transformation, as it is the case today under the long and unfolding shadow of capitalist globalization. If there is some truth in this complaint, if there is some merit in this complaint, and there indeed is, so long as the ruling elite fail to address that complaint, populism, the good, the bad, and the ugly are here to stay. And my project is to analyze how to address this problem. Thank you.
Hello, and many, many thanks in the same gracious and grateful ways that have been expressed before to the entire staff of the Academy and for having us all here and thankfully have met thus far. It's an honor to be here, and I'm the Ellen Maria Gorson Fellow A.L. Steiner, a multimedia visual artist and assistant professor and presidential fellow at Yale University School of Art and core graduate faculty at Bard College in the MFA program. As a self-identified androgyne, my work touches upon the fluctuating intersections of labor, gender, environment, and otherness and togetherness. I co-founded the arts advocacy group Working Artists in the Greater Economy, also known as WAGE, in 2008, and I now serve as a working board member of the organization. And the organization works to implement fair compensatory practices between artists and institutions. And we've thus far certified almost 50 US-based arts institutions who all now pay artist fees in their annual line item budgets. I've abstained from publishing for 15 years since I left the commercial publishing industry, and I left the industry in 2000. There's a book that influenced me to leave the publishing industry, which was authored by William McDonough and Michael Braungart, who is actually a chemist and researcher who lives in Germany. And their book was called Cradle to Cradle, Remaking the Way We Make Things. This is a quote from their book. Quote, "Our current cradle-to-grave manufacturing model that dates to the Industrial Revolution casts off as much as 90% of the materials that it uses, and much of it is toxic." So since reading their material and researching other forms of manufacturing, I've been opposed to utilizing the resources and these processes common in the publishing industry. The industry uses destructive extractive processes in vulnerable communities. They derive paper pulp from virgin forests, the production and the use of toxic bleaches and dyes, and questionable labor practices, as well as production and distribution practices that do not consider the development of integrated environmental systems. The distribution of books and the things that we all kind of participate in different ways, and production are wastefully excessive, and they pollute with each part of the process of manufacturing and distribution. So just to note, there's some facts. The average book sells approximately 250 copies or less. And there's an estimated 13 million previously published books from the past 2 years that are sitting unsold. So if we think about this, we know that the marketplace is hugely oversaturated, but yet our work is contingent upon the production and consumption of our work in some form or another. And just to note a really interesting other fun fact, there's a new book listed on Amazon.com approximately every 5 minutes. To provide a scope of the destruction that we are wreaking with our production, approximately 9 million hectares, which equals 22 million acres, of forests have been cut down in 2017. So that 22 million acres approximates about 36 football fields, if we're thinking about sports analogies, of trees every minute. Digital print-on-demand systems have evolved over the past 10 years, as well as photodegradable and post-consumer supply chain availability of these materials. So I'm researching here, with the generosity of the institution, printing and distribution processes in depth, seeking platforms for this discussion within the visual arts and academic sector. Henry Kissinger's promotion of diplomacy was contingent on what he called constructive ambiguity, which describes the unending hegemonic globalized extraction, production, and consumption cycles. And there's a manifesto about neoclassical economics called the Kick It Over Manifesto, which I'll quote from. Quote, "You claim to work in a pure science of formula and law," responding to economics, "but yours is a social science with all the fragility and uncertainty that this entails. We accuse you of pretending to be what you are not. You hide in your offices protected by your jargon, while in the real world, forests vanish, species perish, human lives are ruined and lost. We accuse you of gross negligence in the management of our planetary household." If you want to hear more about this research and my project, I invite you to come to my talk, which is entitled Fighting Capitalism, and it's not a typo in the program. It really has an R in it. And the talk is October 5th at 7:30. And thank you so very much for hosting me here in Berlin for the fall. And I hope to see you at the talk or at some point in the near future. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vivi Ganesh-Ananthan, and I'm excited to be the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow in Fiction at the Academy this fall. I teach in the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Minnesota, and my first novel, Love Marriage, in Germany, this was published as Die Liebesheirat, was published in 2008 by Random House and by Bertelsmann, and I feel really lucky that the Academy has given me time and space to work on my second book. There was a reference earlier to being torn between the monasterial beauty and the city, and I already find myself very much in that place, but really grateful to be here with the extraordinary welcome of the Academy, its wonderful staff, and in really stimulating conversation with my colleagues. My novel In Progress, Movement, spans the duration of the Sri Lankan Civil War and is set mostly in northern Sri Lanka, where much of that war was fought. The book begins in the 1970s in Sri Lanka, where students who belong to the Tamil minority find themselves on the cusp of deciding which movements they will join and which they will resist. The main character is a woman named Sashi, a medic who is trained partly at a traditional medical school and partly by the Tamil Tigers, militant separatists who are fighting for a separate state. She attends a militarized university where Indian peacekeeping troops, Sri Lankan troops, and the Tamil Tigers all have an influence. Her education takes place under enormous political pressure, 3 kinds of surveillance, 3 kinds of threat, human rights violations by all 3 parties. She has to learn to become a careful reader of political stories and propaganda, the language of state terror, and the language of terrorism. As the war hurtles to a brutal conclusion decades later, the lessons of her history move her to a questionable act of political theater in New York City. I am interested in how war affects civil society, especially women, and how women in particular invent new forms of storytelling as a mode of resistance to fascism and terror. I write about the people who found themselves outside the formal structure of the Tamil Tigers, but who were still connected to them, whether by choice, coercion, or something in between. There is no common language for this gray space, as there is common language for terrorism and for authoritarianism. I'm particularly interested in how a militarized and authoritarian environment affected relationships between students and teachers, as many academics are considering this question now, and as academics at the University of Jaffna in the late 1980s, a group called the University Teachers for Human Rights Jaffna, fought to keep their school open and to defend their students against an environment of increasing psychological pressure as well as physical violence. As you might imagine, for an American to write about these themes surrounded by German history is really inspirational. I hope to see some of you at my Academy reading here. I'm the first person speaking, and I'm speaking next Tuesday, the 26th at 7:30, and I hope to see some of you there, and I will be reading from my work in progress. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Hello, my name is Peter Schmaltz. I am Associate Professor of Musicology at Arizona State University, and I'm very grateful to be an Anna Maria Kellen Fellow here at the American Academy in Berlin this fall. And I also want to thank the staff and everyone else who's made it just such a smooth transition. I've got 2 children here enrolled in a German school, and so as you can imagine, there are complexities involved with it, and it's all gone very smoothly, and I'm very grateful to all the help that people have provided us. I specialize in music of the 20th and the 21st centuries, with a particular focus on music from the Soviet Union and various parts of the former Soviet Union, particularly Russia and increasingly Ukraine. I've also devoted a great deal of thought and writing to music's roles during the Cold War. My first book was called Such Freedom, If Only Musical, Unofficial Soviet Music During the Thaw. And in this book, I looked at the various roles that avant-garde music played in small circles of devoted listeners, performers, and composers in Moscow primarily, but also in Tallinn, in Leningrad, and in Kiev. The project I'm going to be working on at the Academy this fall looks at some of the same material. I'm looking at the 1960s again, and I'm also looking at some of the same composers and performers, but I'm looking at what they did to take this music they were writing and to ship it abroad, particularly to West Germany. There's been a very great amount of excellent research by excellent scholars on music's role as a cultural exchange tool during the 1950s and 1960s, either as a vehicle from the United States State Department or from the Soviet Union and its various ministries and other official organs. I'm interested in the information sharing role that music played at the margins of these official exchange efforts, so that role that music played either completely apart from those official exchange efforts or at the margins of those exchange efforts. I've focused so far on 2 primary nodes in this vast network that I'm hoping to trace out over the course of the remaining few months. The first partner and the first node that I'm looking at was a conductor based in Kiev named Igor Blashkov, who now lives in Potsdam, actually, fortunately for me. And he was exchanging information with a musicologist in Baden-Baden named Fred Preberg. And Blashkov would send Preberg scores and other information about his fellow composers, and Preberg would have that music performed and broadcast sometimes. And then he would send the recordings back to the composers in the Soviet Union, where they were thrilled to hear it, because they couldn't hear that music performed in the Soviet Union at the time. And so I'm following the networks that expanded out from those, like a web, and it involves a number of other important performers and composers on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Some of the composers you may have heard of, some of them you may not have. I'm looking at Valentin Silvestrov, Alfred Schnittke, Arvo Pärt, Edison Denisov, and Andrei Volkonsky. We've heard a great deal over the past year about the role of information in foreign affairs, about information's role as a weapon used to undermine foreign governments, about fake news and Twitter bots, and now, most recently, about targeted Facebook ads. It seems quaint now to think about the 1950s and 1960s when governments seriously shipped musicians around the world as a way to shape and affect hearts and minds. But what I'm interested in is what these unofficial exchange networks from the 1960s can tell us about the political roles and the political impact of information sharing and informal networks today. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Jacqueline Ross, and I'm very honored to be here as the Daimler Fellow at the Academy and as the Prentice Marshall Professor of Law at the University of Illinois College of Law, where I teach criminal law, evidence, and comparative criminal procedure. I'd like to express my gratitude to the Academy for hosting me and for their extraordinary hospitality. And I'm particularly excited to be here in Berlin because this is also the city where I was born. I'm here to complete a book under contract for Cambridge University Press titled Undercover Under Scrutiny, a comparative look at covert policing in the United States, Italy, Germany, and France. My interest in this topic stems in part from my time as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago, where I worked on organized crime and corruption prosecutions from 1990 to 2000. The book is based not only on legal materials, but also on government guidelines, training materials, memoirs of undercover agent, and on about 300 interviews I conducted with police, prosecutors, and judges in the 4 countries that I've been studying from 2001 to the present. The book tries to answer 3 questions. First, what are some of the systemic, legal, and historical reasons why undercover policing remains a relatively unregulated and commonplace investigative tactic in the United States, while European legal systems treat it as exceptional and regulate it much more stringently? Part of the answer, I contend, lies in the 19th century and the origins of the tactic as a form of state surveillance of political enemies in Europe. By contrast, American undercover tactics developed as a grassroots, private sector, self-help strategy in the under-policed Western frontier, in which crime fighting was largely the domain of private detectives. Secondly, the book asks how European undercover policing changed when it was legalized in the early 1990s. What had once been considered gray zone tactics that were borderline illegal were transformed by the process of legalization. And the book asks what it takes to tame a gray zone practice and how the process of legalization transforms such a practice, and how the 3 European systems in my study differ in their approach to bringing undercover policing into harmony with the rule of law. Third, the book explores the impact of 2 international developments on national practices, while pointing out that these developments push undercover practices in somewhat different directions. The first of these 2 developments is American efforts to export American-style undercover practices into Europe through legal, diplomatic, and law enforcement networks. And the second conflicting development is the harmonizing pressure of the European Court of Human Rights and its growing jurisprudence on undercover policing, which has fostered a rights-based European alternative to the American paradigm. So I hope I can entice you to come back here to hear more about this when I give my talk on November 14th. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Özge Samancı, an associate professor at Northwestern University Radio TV Film Department. I'm a Whole Spring Fellow here, and I'm a media artist and graphic novelist. And on the media arts side, I create large-scale installations that has computational element. So when visitors do something, my installations answers them, does something. A recent piece that we completed is called You Are the Ocean, and in that piece, a visitor wears a brainwave sensor, and based on their thinking, they control the ocean waves and clouds. Here in the academy, the work that I'm going to do is a graphic novel, and it doesn't have any computational elements, but it's similar in a sense that I am going to try to push the boundaries of graphic novel by using a unique aesthetic. So in this book called Not Here But Everywhere, like any book, it opens like this. And on the odd pages of the book, I tell the story of Helen, an 40-year-old American living in Istanbul. And on the even pages of the book, I tell the story of Deniz, a 25-year-old Turkish biochemist starting to study in a small college town in the United States, Athens, Ohio. So in each page turn, we follow those stories of these two separate characters. They are in the same story world because they deal with similar themes and they interact with same story characters. So the narration of the book is optimistic, hopeful, and humorous, but the common themes of the book are grief, separation, and defining oneself in a new culture. I'm grateful to Academy for the entire opportunity. It took 5 years for me to complete my previous graphic novel, so the uninterrupted time here is very valuable, and I look forward to contributions of my fellows. Thank you.
Hi, guten Abend. I want to thank you all for coming out here on a Thursday night, and I want to thank the Academy for being so generous with providing us really with a wonderful place to think and work and create and not worry about things that kind of take up a lot of time, like grocery shopping and things like that. So thank you sincerely. My name is Thomas Chatterton Williams. I'm a Holtzbrink Fellow here at the Academy. I'm also an author and a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. And I write there and in other publications about race and class, inheritance, art, literature, film, immigration, radicalization lately, and more broadly about life as an American in France. For the past 6 years, I've made my home in Paris with my French wife, Valentine, and our Franco-American daughter, Marlo. It's only been since Marlo's birth, though, that I've come to fully appreciate my subject and to realize that really what I've always been writing about is identity. Who are we? How do we create ourselves? And how do we draw boundaries around what we believe we are not? My daughter's birth 4 years ago into a nationality, a culture, and even a color that is not my own forced me to reassess various basic assumptions about myself and my family, about my own identity that I had never seriously questioned before. My own father is black and from the segregated South. He's old enough to be my grandfather and came of age before the Civil Rights Movement, firmly under the weight of Jim Crow. My mother is white. Her mother grew up speaking German with her parents, but as so often happens in America, the old world was the last thing on anybody's mind by the time my mom was growing up in Southern California. I was born in 1981 in suburban New Jersey, and like anyone else I knew or ever heard of who was mixed, I was black. This is because the United States at that time, if somewhat less so today, was very much a society governed by plantation logic. A single drop of black blood binds a person to blackness because they are disqualified from being white. Both of my parents raised my brother and me to embrace our black identities, and we did and still do. In this way, my race always struck me as something rather straightforward. What I knew was the same thing my father and almost every black American knows on some level, which is, as James Baldwin put it, whatever he or anyone else may wish to believe, his ancestors are both white and black. Going into it, I understood that my daughter would be mixed, but I never really questioned that, like me, she would primarily be black. But the shock of Marlo's appearance when she was born, the paleness of her skin, the blondness of her hair, and the blueness of her eyes exploded such one-drop logic, even in my mind. The first moments I spent with her in the hospital room, on some deeply irrational, no doubt sleep-deprived, but also viscerally persuasive level, I was briefly seized with the fear that, like some modern Oedipus, I'd metaphorically slept with my white mother and slayed my black dad. Thankfully, the all-encompassing love I feel for my daughter ensured such foolishness couldn't last. When I look at my daughter now, I see a previously unrecognized facet of myself. Yet I also know that most people who meet her will simply call her white. And I can't help but wonder if I've nudged my family across an invisible threshold, the full consequences of which I may or may not even fully discern in my lifetime. Self-Portrait of an Ex-Black Man, the book I am in the process of writing here now, is the story of my American family's multi-generational transformation from what is called black to what is assumed to be white. I chose this admittedly provocative title not because I'm no longer black or because my daughter now is white, but because these categories cannot adequately capture either of us or anyone else for that matter. It will be a book that concerns itself with three seemingly simple questions. What, if anything, remains black in my child? What if I'm a black man capable of having a daughter who looks like this? Does race as we construct it even mean? And what might all of our lives look like if we dared to see past the color line? I'm grateful that you all came out, and I look forward to speaking with you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please joining me first in thanking Professor Allmendinger for the wonderful introduction. And then in recognizing this wonderful group, not only of individual thinkers and artists, but the way they already identify as a cohort, which is really part of the magic that happens here. And please join our fellows and all of us for a reception in the next room immediately. Thank you so much for being here with us.